Hello friends, Assalamu alaikum and welcome to Triple S Treasure. Today I'm gonna tell you about death of Queen Elizabeth and all about her. So before starting the video, please like, comment, share and subscribe our channel Triple S Treasure for watching interesting and beneficial videos. So let's start our video without wasting any time. Queen Elizabeth Alexandra Mary, also known as Queen Elizabeth II, born on 21st April 1926, was Queen of the United Kingdom and other Commonwealth realms from 6 February 1952 until her death in 2022. She was Queen Regnant of 32 sovereign states during her life and served as monarch of 15 of them at the time of her death. Her reign of 70 years and 214 days is the longest of any British monarch and the longest recorded of any female head of state in history. Now let's talk about her early life. Elizabeth was born at 2:40 GMT on 21st April 1926 during the reign of her paternal grandfather King George V. Her father, Prince Albert, Duke of York, was the second son of the king. Her mother, Elizabeth Bowes-Lyon, Duchess of York, was the youngest daughter of a Scottish aristocrat. Elizabeth's only sibling, Princess Margaret, was born in 1930. The two princesses were educated at home under the supervision of their mother and their governess, Marian Crawford. Lessons concentrated on history, language, literature, and music. Crawford published a biography of Elizabeth and Margaret's childhood years entitled The Little Princesses in 1950, much the dismay of the royal family. The book describes Elizabeth's love of horses and dogs, her order lines, and her attitude of responsibility. Others echoed such observations. Winston Churchill described Elizabeth when she was two as a character. She has an air of authority and reflectiveness astonishing in an infant. Her cousin Margaret Rhodes described her as a jolly little girl but fundamentally sensible and well behaved. Elizabeth was born in Mayfair, London as the first child of the Duke and Duchess of York. Her father acceded to throne in 1936 upon the abdication of his brother King Edward VIII, making Elizabeth the heir presumptive. She was educated privately at home and began to undertake public duties during the Second World War, serving in the Auxiliary Territorial Service. In November 1947, she married Philip Mountbatten, a former prince of Greece and Denmark, and their marriage lasted 73 years until his death in April 2021. They had 4 children: Charles III, Anne, Princess Royal, Prince Andrew, Duke of York, and Prince Edward, Earl of Wessex. During her grandfather's reign, Elizabeth was third in the line of succession to the British throne, behind her uncle Edward and her father. Although her birth generated public interest, she was not expected to become queen, as Edward was still young and likely to marry and have children of his own, who would precede Elizabeth in the line of succession. When her grandfather died in 1936 and her uncle succeeded as Edward VIII, she became second in line to the throne. After her father, later that year, Edward abdicated after his proposed marriage to divorced socialite Wallis Simpson provoked a constitutional crisis. Consequently, Elizabeth's father became king, taking the regional name George VI. Since Elizabeth had no brothers, she became her presumptive of if her parents had subsequently born a son, he would have been her apparent and above her in the line of succession, which was determined by male preference primogeniture. In September 1939, Britain entered the Second World War. Lord Hailsham suggested that Princess Elizabeth and Margaret should be evacuated to Canada to avoid the frequent and aerial bombings of London by the Luftwaffe. This was rejected by their mother, who declared, "The children won't go without me, I won't leave without the king, and the king will never leave." The princess stayed at Balmoral Castle, Scotland until Christmas 1939, when they moved to Sandringham House, Norfolk. From February to May 1940, they lived at Royal Lodge, Windsor, until moving the Windsor Castle, where they lived for most of the next 5 years. At Windsor, the princesses staged pantomimes at Christmas in aid of the Queen's Wool Fund, which bought yarn to knit into military garments. In 1940, the 14-year-old Elizabeth made her first radio broadcast during the BBC's Children's Hours, addressing other children who had been evacuated from the cities. She stated, "We are trying to do all we can to help our gallant sailors, soldiers and airmen, and we are trying to bear our own share of the danger and sadness of war. We know, every one of us, that in the end all will be well." Significant events include Elizabeth's coronation in 1953 and the celebrations of her silver, golden, diamond and platinum jubilees in 1977, 2002, 2012 and 2022 respectively. Elizabeth was the longest lived and longest reigning British monarch and the second longest reigning sovereign in world history, only behind Louis XIV of France. She faced occasional Republican sentiment and media criticism of her family, particularly after the breakdowns of her children's marriages, her annus horribilis in 1992 and the death of her former daughter-in-law Diana, Princess of Wales in 1997. However, support for the monarchy in the United Kingdom remains constantly high, as did her personal popularity. Elizabeth died aged 96 at Balmoral Castle and was succeeded by her eldest son Charles III, primogeniture at the time. Elizabeth received private tuition in constitutional history from Henry Martin, Vice Provost of Eton College, and learned French from a succession of native-speaking governors. A Girl Guides Company, the first Buckingham Palace company, was formed especially so she could socialize with girls her own age. Later, she was enrolled as a sea ranger. In 1939, Elizabeth's parents toured Canada and the United States. As in 1927, when they had toured Australia and New Zealand, Elizabeth remained in Britain since her father thought her too young to undertake public tours. She looked tearful as her parents departed. They corresponded regularly, and she and her parents made the first Royal Transatlantic telephone call on 18th May. When her father died in February 1952, Elizabeth, then 25 years old, became Queen of independent Commonwealth countries, as well as head of the Commonwealth. Elizabeth reigned as a constitutional monarch through major political changes such as the Troubles in Northern Ireland, devolution in the United Kingdom, the decolonization of Africa, and the United Kingdom's accession to the European communities and withdrawal from the European Union. The number of her regimes varied over time as territories gained independence and some regimes became republics. Her many historic visits and meetings include state visits in China in 1986, Russia in 1994, and the Republic of Ireland in 2011, and visits with 5 popes. Elizabeth met her future husband Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark in 1934 and again in 1937. They were second cousins, once removed through King Christian IX of Denmark, and third cousins through Queen Victoria. After meeting for the third time at the Royal Naval College in Dartmouth in July 1939, Elizabeth, only 13 years old, said she fell in love with Philip and they began to exchange letters. She was 21 when their engagement was officially announced on 9 July 1947. The engagement was not without controversy. Philip had no financial standing, was foreign born, and had sisters who had married German noblemen with Nazi links. Marion Crawford wrote, "Some of the king's advisers did not think him good enough for her. He was a prince without a home or kingdom." Some of the papers played long and loud tunes on the string of Philip's foreign origin. Later biographies reported that Elizabeth's mother had reservation about the union initially and teased Philip as the Hun. In later life, however, the Queen Mother told biographer Tim Hill that Philip was an English gentleman. Philip broke the news to the new queen. She chose to retain Elizabeth as her original name. Thus she was called Elizabeth II, which offended many Scots as she was the first Elizabeth to rule in Scotland. She was proclaimed queen throughout her realms and the royal party hastily returned to the United Kingdom. Elizabeth and Philip moved into Buckingham Palace. At the end of the war in Europe, on Victory in Europe Day, Elizabeth and Margaret mingled incognito with the celebrating crowds in the streets of London. Elizabeth is later said in a rare interview, "We asked my parents if we could go out and see for ourselves. I remember we were terrified of being recognized. I remember lines of unknown people linking arms and walking down Whitehall. All of us just swept along on a tide of happiness and relief." In 1943, Elizabeth undertook her first solo public appearance on a visit to the Grenadier Guards, of which she had been appointed colonel the previous year. As she approached her 18th birthday, Parliament changed the law so she could act as one of the 5 consolers of state in the event of her father's incapacity or absence abroad, such as his visit to Italy in July 1944. In February 1945, she was appointed an honorary second subaltern in the Auxiliary Territorial Service with the service number of 230873. She trained as a driver and mechanic and was given the rank of honorary junior commander, female equivalent of captain at the time. 5 months later, pilgrimage to the tomb of the unknown warrior at Westminster Abbey to mark the centenary of his burial. In 2021, she received her first and second COVID-19 vaccinations in January and April respectively. Elizabeth never planned to abdicate, though she took on fewer public engagements as she grew older and Prince Charles took on more of her duties. In 2002, Elizabeth marked her Golden Jubilee, the 50th anniversary of her accession. Her sister and mother died in February and March respectively, and the media speculated on whether the Jubilee would be a success or a failure. She again undertook an extensive tour of her realms, beginning in Jamaica in February, where she called a farewell banquet memorable after a power cut plunged the King's House, the official residence of the Governor-General, into darkness. As in 1977, there were street parties and commemorative events and moments were named to honor the occasion. 1 million people attended each day of the 3-day main Jubilee celebration in London, and the enthusiasm shows for Elizabeth by the public was greater than many journalists had anticipated. Later that month, Elizabeth had mild cold-like symptoms and tested positive for COVID-19 along with some staff and family members. She cancelled 2 virtual audiences on 22 Feb, but held a phone conversation with Prime Minister Boris Johnson the following day amid a crisis on the Russo-Ukrainian border, following which she made a donation to the Disaster Emergency Committee Ukraine humanitarian appeal. On 28 Feb, she was reported to have recovered and spent time with her family at Frogmore. On 7th March, Elizabeth met Canadian Prime Minister Justin at Windsor Castle in her first in-person engagement since her COVID diagnosis. She later remarked that COVID infection leaves one very tired and exhausted. It's not a nice result. In 1977, Elizabeth marked the silver jubilee of her accession, Parties and events took place throughout the Commonwealth, many coinciding with her associated national and Commonwealth tours. The celebrations reaffirmed Elizabeth's popularity, despite virtually coincident negative press coverage of Prince Margaret's separation from her husband, Lord Snowdon, in 1978. Elizabeth endured a state visit to the United Kingdom by Romania's communist leader Nicolae and his wife Elena. Though privately she thought that had blood on their hands. The following year brought two blows on was the unmasking of Anthony Blunt, former surveyor of the Queen's pictures, as a communist spy. The other was the assassination of her relative and in-law Lord Mountbatten by the Provisional Irish Republican Army. Princess Elizabeth went on her first overseas tour in 1947, accompanying her parents through southern Africa. During the tour, in a broadcast to the British Commonwealth on her 21st birthday, she made the following pledge: I declare before you all that my whole life, whether it be long or short, shall be devoted to your service and the service of your great imperial family, which we all belong. The speech was written by Dermot Moore, a journalist for the Times. George VI's health declined during 1951, and Elizabeth frequently stood in for him at public events. When she toured Canada and visited President Harry S. Truman in Washington, D.C. in October 1951, her private secretary Martin Curtis carried a draft accession declaration in case of the king's death while she was on tour. In early 1952, Elizabeth and Philip set out for a tour of Australia and New Zealand by way of Kenya. On 6 February 1952, they had just returned to their Kenyan home, Sagana Lodge, after a night spent at Treetops Hotel, when word arrived of the death of George VI and Elizabeth's consequent accession to the throne with immediate effect. After that, 2014 Scottish independence referendum, Prime Minister David Cameron stated that Elizabeth was pleased with the outcome. She had agreeably issued a public coded statement about the referendum by telling one woman outside Balmoral Kirk that she hoped people would think very carefully about the outcome. It emerged later that
Prince
Cameron
Philip died
had
on 9th April
specifically
2021
requested that
after
she
73
register her
years of
consent,
marriage,
making Elizabeth the first British monarch to reign as a widow or widower since Queen Victoria. She was reportedly at her husband's bedside when he died and remarked in private that his death had left a huge void. Due to the COVID-19 restrictions in place in England at the time, Elizabeth sat alone at Philip's funeral service, which evoked sympathy from people around the world. In her Christmas broadcast that year, she paid a personal tribute to her beloved Philip, saying that mischievous inquiring twinkle was as bright at the end as when I first set eyes on him. According to the news, is that first Philip's coffin will be removed from the grave, then the Queen's coffin will be placed in the grave, and then Philip's coffin will be placed on top of it. Elizabeth's 2012 Diamond Jubilee marked 60 years on the throne, and celebrations were held throughout her realms, the wider Commonwealth and beyond. She and her husband undertook an extensive tour of the United Kingdom, while her children and grandchildren embarked on royal tours of other Commonwealth states on her behalf. On 4th June, Jubilee beacons were lit around the world. While touring Manchester as part of her Jubilee celebrations, Elizabeth made a surprise appearance at a wedding party at Manchester Town Hall, which then made international headlines. In November, Elizabeth and her husband celebrated their Blue Sphere wedding anniversary 65th on 18 December. She became the first British sovereign to attend a peacetime cabinet meeting since George III in 1781. Numerous commemorations are planned, from moments of silence to military gun salutes and remembrances in honor of Elizabeth. The royal family posts an online book of condolence on its website. Before the marriage, Philip renounced his Greek and Danish titles, officially converted from Greek Orthodoxy to Anglicanism, and adopted the style, taking the surname of his mother's British family. Shortly before the wedding, he was created Duke of Edinburgh and granted the style His Royal Highness. Elizabeth and Philip were married on 20 November 1947 at Westminster Abbey. They received 2,500 wedding gifts from around the world. Elizabeth required Grecian coupons to buy the material for her gown, which was designed by Norman Hartnell, because Britain had not yet completely recovered from the devastation of the war. In post-war Britain, it was not acceptable for Philip's German relations, including his 3 surviving sisters, to be invited to the wedding. Neither was an invitation extended to the Duke of Windsor, formerly King Edward VIII. On 8 September 2022, Buckingham Palace announced that Elizabeth was under medical supervision at Balmoral Castle after doctors expressed concern. The statement read, "Following further evolution this morning, Elizabeth's doctors are concerned for Her Majesty's health and have recommended she remain under medical supervision. The Queen remains comfortable and Balmoral." Elizabeth's 4 children, along with her daughter-in-laws and grandsons Prince William and Prince Harry, travelled to Balmoral. Her death was confirmed that evening at 18:30 BST, setting in motion Operation London Bridge, and because she died in Scotland, Operation Unicorn. She received many credits and many awards for doing work in her Commonwealth and doing work for the world. She visited many countries, including Pakistan. She visited Pakistan 2 times in her government. Elizabeth rarely gave interviews and little was known of her personal feelings. She did not explicitly express her own political opinions in a public forum, and it is against convention to ask or reveal the monarch's views. When Times journalist Paul asked Elizabeth for her opinions on the miners' strike of 1984 till 85, she replied that it was all about one man, with which Paul disagreed. Widely criticized in the media for asking the question, Paul said he was not initially due to be present for the royal visit and was unaware of the protocols. On day 1st, September 9, the king announced a period of royal mourning to be observed until 7 days after the Queen's funeral on Monday, September 19. 2 96 round gun salutes honoring the Queen, 1 round for each year of her life, were fired at 1 p.m. local time Friday in London, in Hyde Park and at the Tower of London. Elizabeth was patron of more than 600 organizations and charities. The Charities Aid Foundation estimates that Elizabeth had raised over 1.4 billion for her patronages during her reign. Her main leisure interests including equestrianism and dogs, especially her Pembroke Welsh Corgis. Her lifelong love of corgis began in 1933 with Dookie, the first corgi owned by her family. Scenes of a relaxed, informal home life were occasionally witnessed. She and her family from time to time prepared a meal together and washed the dishes afterwards. Despite the pandemic, Elizabeth attended the 2021 state opening of Parliament in May and the 47th G7 summit in June. On 5th July, the 73rd anniversary of the founding of the UK's National Health Service, she announced that the NHS will be awarded to the George Cross to recognize all NHS staff, past and present, across all disciplines and all 4 nations. In October 2021, she began using a walking stick during people engagements for the first time since her operation in 2004. Following an overnight stay in hospital on 20 October, visits to Northern Ireland, the COP26 summit in Glasgow, and the 2021 National Service of Remembrance were cancelled on health grounds. Now I will tell you 10 days plan of funeral of Queen Elizabeth. So on the main day, September 8, the royal household notifies the public of the Queen's death. Prince Charles immediately succeeds to the throne upon his mother's death. He will be known as King Charles III. His wife Camilla becomes Queen Consort. The couple stay at Balmoral overnight. Flags fly at half-staff across the British government and will remain so until 8 a.m. on the morning after the Queen's funeral. Charles issues a brief statement, as does UK Prime Minister Liz Truss. Elizabeth's Platinum Jubilee began on 6 Feb 2022, marking 70 years since she acceded to the throne on her father's death. On the eve of the date, she held a reception at Sandringham House for pensioners, local Women's Institute members and charity volunteers. In her Accession Day message, Elizabeth renewed her commitment to a lifetime of public service, which she had originally made in 1947. Elizabeth gave birth to her first child, Prince Charles, on 14 November 1948. 1 month earlier, the king had issued letters patent allowing her children to use the style and title of a royal prince or princess, to which they otherwise would not have been entitled, as their father was no longer a royal prince. A second child, Princess Anne, was born on 15 August 1950. On 5th April, in a televised broadcast watched by an estimated 24 million viewers in the UK, she asked people to take comfort that while we may have more still to endure, better days will return. We will be with our friends again. We will be with our families again. We will meet again. On 8 May, the 75th anniversary of VE Day, in a TV broadcast at 9 p.m., the exact time at which her father George VI had broadcast to the nation on the same day in 1945, she asked people to never give up, never despair. In October, she visited the UK's Defence Science and Technology Laboratory in Wiltshire, her first public engagement since the start of the pandemic. On 4th November, she appeared masked for the first time in public during a private pilgrimage. On 19th March 2020, as the COVID-19 pandemic hit the United Kingdom, Elizabeth moved to Windsor Castle and squatted there as a precaution. Public engagements were cancelled and Windsor Castle followed a strict sanitary protocol nicknamed HMS Bubble. During the war, plans were drawn up to quell Welsh nationalism by affiliating Elizabeth more closely with Wales. Proposals such as appointing her Constable of Carnforth Castle or a patron of Gobelt Cymru were abandoned for several reasons, including fear of associating Elizabeth with conscientious objectors in the Urd at the time when Britain was at war. Welsh politicians suggested she be made Princess of Wales on her 18th birthday. Some Home Secretary Herbert Morrison supported the idea, but the king rejected it because he felt such a title belonged solely to the wife of a Prince of Wales, and the Prince of Wales had always been the heir apparent. In 1946, she was inducted into the Grost of Birds at the National Institute of Wales. Afterwards, her coffin will be transported to Windsor Castle, where a final service will be held in St. George's Chapel. Finally, the Queen will be buried. In week 1, on Saturday morning, the Association Council met at St. James's Palace in London, where it formally declared Elizabeth's death and proclaimed the new sovereign accession to the throne. Charles then read and signed a centuries-old oath to uphold the security of the Church in Scotland and ensure continuity of government. On the same day, senior members of Parliament took an oath of allegiance to King Charles III. The two houses continued their tributes and framed a message of condolence to the king. Meanwhile, in Scotland, a procession will transport the Queen's coffin from the Palace of Holyrood House to St. Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh on Monday, September 12. The king and other members of the royal family will take part in the procession and attend a service at the cathedral, after which the public will be able to pay their respects. On Tuesday, the Royal Air Force has transport Elizabeth's body from Scotland to London. On Wednesday, a ceremonial procession by the King's Troops Royal Horse Artillery will accompany her coffin from Buckingham Palace to Westminster. There, the Archbishop of Canterbury will conduct a short ceremony, after which she will lie in state at Westminster Hall for several days. The public was able to visit for 23 hours of each day. As final funeral preparations are being made in London, Charles will travel to Scotland, Northern Ireland and Wales, visiting leaders in the United Kingdom. So friends, that's all for today's video. We told you about Queen Elizabeth and her whole life circle. So if you like our videos, so kindly like, comment, share and subscribe our channel S.S Treasure for watching interesting and beneficial videos. Allah Hafiz. Thanks for watching. See you in next video.